We have people joining us today from all around the world, so I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands you're joining us from, wherever in the world that may be, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. In my case, I'm paying my respects to the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation in northern New South Wales. I'd also like to acknowledge that in Australia, sovereignty was never ceded, and we're living and working on what is and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. So, a little bit about me before we get started. My name's Cam Elliott, and I'm the head of Clear Horizon Academy. Clear Horizon, for those of you not familiar with us, is one of Asia Pacific's largest evaluation and design companies. We've been around for about 15 years. And Jess, who's on my screen to the right of me, is our founding director and CEO. I'll get into introducing Jess and our other panelists in a moment. So we're based in Melbourne. Our bread and butter is supporting change makers to co-design and evaluate solutions for people, place, and planet. And our academy, where today's session fits in, is part of our learning arm, which is all dedicated to translating what we do day in, day out, our consultants' knowledge and skills into practical learning opportunities. So as part of that, we deliver webinars like this. We also deliver short and long courses in things like measurement, evaluation and learning, theory of change, data visualization and reporting, evaluating system change and place-based approaches. And then the topic of today's webinar, we also deliver courses in most significant change as well. So a little bit about how today is going to run before we dive in. In a moment, as I said, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists, and then we'll find out a little bit about them, and then a little bit about you, our audience. So I'll throw out a few questions then to the panelists to get the discussion going, and then in the final 20 minutes or so, we'll open up to questions from you and hear what you'd like to find out a bit more about. If you do want a panelist to answer one of your questions, at any moment during the session today, you can open up the little box down the bottom of the screen, which is called Q&A. So go ahead and open that up now, just so you can see the functionality. And you can type in your question in there. If you see a question that someone's already typed in that you like the look of and you want to hear that answered, use the upvote button or the like button. And the questions that get the most upvotes will be the questions that I put to our panelists. So yeah, make sure you get in there and use that function if you can. You can also use the chat function. And this is where it'd be great if you have any questions or needing any clarification around terms we're using, for instance, anything that comes up in the discussion that you want to get a bit more clarity on, drop your question or your comment in there. You can also use it to chat with us just on the side or chat with other people in the room as well. So it's just a great little tool to avail yourself of. Really encourage you to get in there and get active if you can. Someone asked before the session started if we'll be recording the session, and definitely, yes, you can probably see up in the top left-hand corner of the screen, we're definitely recording it, and we'll be sending that recording through tomorrow in an email, and also putting it up on social media, so you can definitely, no need to stress about taking detailed notes, it'll all be available for you later on. So, with the formalities out of the way, it's now my pleasure to introduce our guest panelists. They're all doctors, so it's the three doctors with us today. We have Dr. Rick Davies, Dr. Irene Guijt, and Dr. Jess. Give us all a wave. All right, so I'll introduce each of them in turn. A little bit about Rick. Rick is an experienced evaluator. He's the inventor of multiple evaluation tools, including MSC, and he's had over 30 years experience working with NGOs, bilateral and multilateral institutions on the evaluation of international development aid programs. He's placed a quote at the top of his website that I think is really apt. There's great satisfaction in building good tools for other people to use. If that quote is even half accurate, Rick must be a very satisfied man. So we're very grateful to have Rick with us. I have a question for you, Rick, just to get us to know you a little bit better. What might people not expect about you or may not know about you?
Oh my God. Some people might not know that I'm a bit of an obsessional swimmer and table tennis player and cyclist and runner. To the
Hopefully
point
we
where
don't
I
do all
have
of them at the
various
same time.
accumulated injuries at the moment that I'm trying to get over.
Yeah, I hope you don't do the swimming and the table tennis and the cycling at the same time. That'd be
Very
might
difficult.
explain the injury. Thanks, Rick. Irene is the head of research and publishing at Oxfam, Great Britain. She's a researcher, facilitator, and author of several books on the topic of learning-oriented knowledge processes. She has over 25 years of experience in learning processes and systems in development, natural resource management, collective action, and social justice. Very grateful again to have Irene. My question for you is, if you had one wish, what would you spend it on?
Wow.
Absolutely no question. Yesterday was the International Day of Peace, so it would have to be global peace. Big advances possible there, big wish.
A huge area, and yeah, definitely needed now more than ever. Jess, last but definitely not least, as I said before, the founder and CEO of Clear Horizon. You're also the co-collaborator or co-conspirator in the development of the MSC user guide. And also you created or invented the collaborative outcomes reporting technique, which is well known, especially in the NRM sector. Welcome. And my question for you is, what's the most awkward fashion trend you followed?
I know.
I'm dying to hear what you were going to ask me. Oh, fashion trend. Well, maybe I'm still in one, I'm not sure. I definitely, yeah, I remember wearing some granny shoes when I was about 11, 12, and my mother wouldn't let me have them. They were really popular and they were quite high, and I was 11 and I snuck out and I bought them and then I hid them in the cupboard. There you go. But my mother was not impressed at me having these granny shoes.
I think you need to share a picture of them in the chat box if you can.
I don't know whether anybody ever else had any granny shoes. Maybe somebody. I was a goth too. Somebody said that I used to be a goth. I was a goth. I did actually have much better than granny shoes. I've got to say this now. I did have blue hair at one point. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that what you would have said, Rick, about Jess?
No, I was never a goth.
I went through lots of bad phases.
I think we should move on. We should
yes,
be.
Yes.
Yes, let's move on.
Sorry, thank you very much for
people want to listen to, not this oldie stuff.
All right, well, let's do that. So now it's the audience's turn to find out a little bit more about themselves, and also for us to find out about them. So Keisha is going to share or pull up a poll in a moment, but first I'd love it if you could type in, but don't hit enter, the response to this question into the chat. So where in the world do you call home? So type in the response to that in chat and hit enter when you get a chance. Actually, sorry, I'll tell you when to hit enter. So hold off on hitting enter. Give you a couple more seconds to write it in, and now far away, hit enter.
Bloody hell.
Great, so a lot of Australia, UK, India, all over the shop. Netherlands.
Quite a few. Indonesia.
Indonesia, yeah.
I saw Uganda.
Uganda, yeah.
Myanmar. Beijing.
Nigeria, several people from Nigeria.
Yeah.
Mm. So truly an international audience, which is great. And fitting, I guess, given our panelists' background as well in international
Welcome to Saka.
So the next thing we'd like to find out about you is the field of work that you work in. So we're going to have a poll pulled up by Keisha. And you can select from those options. You can only pick one, unfortunately, and then hit submit. Okay, and hopefully you've all got a chance to fill that in, and we'll close the poll. And the results should pop up. All right, so what have we got here? The leader is definitely international development, not surprising. followed by community development, it looks like, and consultancy. And then a big cohort from health and government and public policy. Thank you for that. The next question we have is, how familiar are you with MSC as a technique? We've got a few options in this question. I think you can tick as many as applies. Another few seconds just to get your response in. And Peter Wright says, most of us work across a few areas rather than being discrete. Thanks, Peter. We'll make sure next time we have a multiple choice option for that question. Yeah. So let's see what we've got here in terms of responses. Great. Okay, I've read articles about MSC as a leader. Heard about MSC before, but never used it. That's interesting. Okay. Read that MSC user guide as the third most common. So it looks like most people have at least heard about it. Great. And yeah, fair few people with some experience applying it. Excellent. So the panelists will keep that in mind as they pitch their responses to the questions. And I will too with my questions as well. All right, so now we're into the meaty bit. We've done the introductions. I'd love to kick off with a question for you, Rick. As the founder or creator of this thing we're talking about, how did you come up with MSC?
I think there were two key moments. The first was in 1991 when I was in Nairobi and I was reading a book by Gregory Bateson called Mind and Nature, A Necessary Unity. And that gave me a key idea about how to think about learning in organizations and how to think about information. And then the second key moment, and I'll recommend that book to people, by the way. The second key moment was in 1992 when I was doing my field work in Bangladesh for the first stage, at the first stage of my PhD. And I'd interviewed about 30 chief executive officers of the largest NGOs. And one night I had the idea that I should call all these people back together in a meeting and feed back the results and then ask them as a group to identify which of all those 30 changes they thought were the most significant changes for the NGO sector in Bangladesh in that year. And that really was the beginning of my whole thinking about the design of the MSC process. And if you want to find more about that, a link to my thesis will be circulated along with other references at the end of this event.
Thanks, Rick. I'm interested, what was the key challenge you were trying to solve through that process initially?
Well, basically, I was working with an NGO called CCDB, Christian Commission for Development in Bangladesh, and they had received funding for a large rural development program, which was very participatory, and it involved the transfer of a small but significant amount of money to small groups of women in multiple communities across Bangladesh. And they were being pressed by their donors to report on what were the outcomes happening here. And at that time, the standard approach would be, well, we need to find some indicators of outcomes that are important and then measure them and then document them. But because they had decentralized power to all these local groups, everybody wanted to do something differently and were at different stages of doing those things. So finding a single indicator just wasn't on the cards at all. And I was in contact with the chief executive of this NGO and told them about this experience that I've just recounted with the analysis of the interviews of the surveys, and said, well, maybe we could do something like that on a test scale in about 4 districts where this project is going, and see how it works as a way of what you might call impact monitoring the impact of the program as it was developing. And he bought into that, and that led to a 12-month trial of the process, and thereafter it continued. And when I came back in 2000, which is about 6 years later, it was still continuing, and they'd expanded to other programs.
Great, thank you for that extra context, Rick. Irene, how did you first come across MSC? How did the love affair start for you?
So what I remember was entering a big hall somewhere in London after a rather sleepless night of pondering some work in Brazil. And it was a presentation by Rick And if I'm not mistaken, it was for ODI, but it was in 1994, which is very odd because he published it only in 1996. And I remember you had a little pile of stapled photocopies of your draft article at the front, and I took it, and it was like a penny dropped for me. I thought, this is what I need to get out of my frustration with everything that's predefined and is tangible. I was keen to try and figure out how to value what people were seeing was shifting. That wasn't something they needed to know ahead of time. So that was has led to a long collaboration, and Rick ending up being my PhD supervisor at a certain point as well, for better or for worse, right, Nick?
Which, and going back to, it sounds like the key thing you were looking for was something to capture those unintended outcomes, which is what MSC is so great at doing.
Yes, I was working in Brazil with trade unions, local trade unions, very, very tiny little outfits, and working with CSOs, and it was very messy, and they were in this long-term collaboration, and every time plans would change and shift, and they would try and move not just their livelihoods and their honey production, but also shifting local government policy and the quality of their collaboration. And how were we going to capture those much more qualitative aspects that were laying the foundation for this long-term change process, actually. So that was what we were really trying to figure out, how to not make it too contained and constrained by very narrow indicators.
Great. Thanks, Ivana. Jess, how about you? How did you first come across MSC?
Well, yes, when Rick was in Bangladesh, I was living in Western India, and I was like a graduate. I was what's called an APO, an Associate Professional Officer for DFID, or was ODA then. And so I was placed on this fairly remote project. A bit like Rick's problem is that there were 42 villages, and they were all going through this participatory development process, and each village developed their own 5-year development plan, and they were all completely different. And so, yeah, I didn't have much with me because there was no internet. It's hard to believe, isn't it? No internet. So there I am in a village, in a small dusty town in Gujarat, and I didn't have much. And so I was basically trying to apply what I knew, which was participatory rural development techniques. So trying to understand change by mapping and diagramming. And I got all this convoluted stuff going to try and understand change before and after. Couldn't find any common indicators because everybody did different things. At that time, this is a long time ago, isn't it? It's really showing our age, but this is like nearly 30 years ago, okay? And at that time, what was trending was participatory process projects. Do you remember that? It was all about this, like, it's all about a process and going on each individual bespoke process almost. And there was, yeah, no common indicators. So we were stumped. M&E tools did not work for us at that point. All I got was a paragraph. I don't know where I got the paragraph from because I was in India. I think it was because we both worked for Swansea University indirectly. And I got this paragraph. I didn't get the article. And so I got the paragraph and I thought, this is better than what I'm thinking. So I got really excited, like Irene. It opened up a whole idea about how to do things differently. I began to play with it. It set me off, spinning in all sorts of different directions. And I still love that about MSC. I think it opens a door to think differently about monitoring and evaluation, and it opened a door for me. And then I went on and left India and came to Australia to do my PhD. And I did one part of my case study on using most significant change as it came to become. But at the beginning, it wasn't called that. It was called the evolutionary approach to organizational learning. Do you remember that first name,
Yes.
Rick?
That was
a mouthful.
Yeah.
And when I shared it with the farmers in Gippsland, they just laughed at me and they said, "You what?" So I had to come up with, I was like, the story approach. So we called it the story approach for a while, but that wasn't right. It was Rick and I who bashed out the name together, didn't we? I feel like we spent a while landing on the name when we put the guide together. Yeah. But it didn't start off with that name. That came in 2005, didn't it? The name? Yeah, with the onset of the book. So it is published under a few different things before that.
That's interesting, because I was using it in 1996, and we called it Most Significant Change then. I remember the Portuguese translation.
Sure?
I'm sure, because I was looking in my
Oh.
files.
Well,
Anyway, it doesn't matter, but
we can't remember what happens in history. It's too long ago, isn't it?
Oh gosh, no joke.
Oh, I thought we came up with it in 2000. Oh, about 2000 it would have been, because the guide, 2000.
Either way, it sounds like it was a good move to rebrand.
One way or other.
Yeah,
Sure.
Mariana in the chat says, "Well done for finding a snappier name," and yeah, definitely. All right, so the second question, and we'll start with Jess this time. How do you most commonly use MSC? How does it fit in with other methods that you might use?
Okay, well, so I guess, we do two things at Clear Horizon. We use it a lot, I should say. It's a core tool of at Clear Horizon, so we're using it constantly. And we use it in two ways. One is we get asked to help build measurement, evaluation and learning systems that an organization or a community will run themselves. And we often design in some element of most significant change, not on its own. I think it's important to note that we would never have it as a standalone tool. It's always with other methods, often some more quantitative or wide-reaching or representative measurement, and then some most significant change. Because I always think the most basic, effective measurement framework is like a small amount of good quantitative data like reach, as well as some solid, narrative. So we use it there, and we facilitate, how to do the selection process. And then increasingly we use it in evaluation. So we use it in evaluations, normally just in a one-off method. So we would have one round of collection. Sometimes it's participatory, and we train people to collect the stories. And then we have one mass selection event at what we call a summit workshop. And again, at that summit workshop, we bring other lines of data. So we bring quantitative data, visuals, graphs, surveys, and we do our round of selection. We do it in a large group, so tables in a big room. They do their selection concurrently. We read out the ones that are selected. We do a mass analysis, and that's something that we do a lot of. So it's in a sort of co-evaluation context as well. And finally, we also use it in early stages of designs these days to try and find out what's worked before, and we use that to build theory of change. So it's a really great and organic way to build a theory of change. So 3 ways,
It's also, I've encountered it used as sort of a marketing or PR tool almost to tell the story of change to a broader audience as well.
Well, that's not really, I'm going to have to pull you up there, Cam. That's not a good use of MSC. If you just want to use, I'm sure you planted that question deliberately. If you just want to sell what you've done, you're better off just getting a journalist to do that, because MSC is a rigorous approach that involves a rigorous analysis methodology. And if you're not doing that analysis, the selection process, you're not doing MSC. And it costs money and it takes time to do that. So if you just want PR, go and get yourself a journalist, much more effective. Would you agree, guys? My panelist.
Yep.
I think Cam was being provocative then. I think it's got me going.
So I'm going to continue to be provocative. Do either of our panelists have any other ways that they use, or anything they object to in the way that Jess described that?
No, I find myself in strong agreement. Sorry, Irene.
No, go ahead, Rick.
No.
Well, I used MSC early on in 1998, 99, and since then, actually not personally. I've moved on to other things. But in Oxfam, they do use it, but they use it well in different ways. But they often use it as a kind of a hybrid with outcome harvesting. So it's the thing that is appealing for Oxfam is that it's an off-the-shelf, fairly easy to use, although I think we should come back to what's hard about it in the conversation. It's harder than it looks if you want to do it well. I think that's what Jess was also inferring. And I have seen, well, we call it stories of change. And it often is used within a quite an elaborate theory of change understanding. So I have seen it used that way quite a lot with the kinds of work that Oxfam does, which tends to be about slightly less tangible, more emergent kinds of change, such as capacity strengthening, cohesion of alliances, policy shifts, behavior changes. And I think that's where it really excels. So that's where I've seen it, but I don't see a lot of it in a pure form in Oxfam.
Okay. Thanks, Irene.
Cameron, did you want me to comment about my use of it at this stage or later?
Yeah, sure. Go for it, Rick.
Okay. I think my answer is a bit like Irene's in part, and a bit like Jess's. I don't use MSC these days myself for similar reasons to Irene, that my interests have moved on. I'm no longer working at the coalface, inverted commas, big inverted commas, directly with real communities. And my work has taken me further and further away into more distant and abstract issues that have probably got less relevance to people's real lives, unfortunately. But in the process, I'm still keeping track of the use of MSC, and I've been developing an online bibliography of the use of MSC. So while I'm not doing it, I am keeping a record of its uses and making that available to people. And that's something we'll be sharing as a result of this event. I agree with Jess on the complementarity. We've always argued that MSC is a complementary tool along with quantitative and various other methods. There's rarely an argument for using it solely by itself. Probably the only setting where I can imagine where it is relevant might be in some specific research setting where you've got quite a narrow question that you're investigating. But evaluations typically have multiple questions they're trying to answer, and they need multiple methods, often in conjunction. So I think the other thing just to note that, the ideas behind MSC still have a big influence on my thinking. And some of you may be aware that I've developed this participatory scenario planning tool called PAR-EVO, which is built on very much the same basic ideas as MSC. So while I'm not doing MSC directly these days, the ideas are still very much, I'm still finding them very useful. Other people are still finding them very useful.
So it's taken on a life of its own in terms of how it's evolved for you as well. It sounds like, it is a very evolutionary tool or approach, isn't it?
That's one of the significant, changes as a result of MSC, I think, is it's one of those springboard methodologies. For a lot of people, it is the first qualitative evaluation method they'll learn. And it can get them to learn about qualitative data and also to think differently about measurement. I certainly know I've sort of, it made me, I sort of developed some methods that sort of sprung out of it as well. Like there's one that we've been working with a lot. Lately, we call it most significant learning, Rick. You might not have heard of it. It's really quite good fun. And it's not about the most significant change. It's about a time when you had an assumption that turned out not to be true and how that happened. And so it's particularly about assumptions that didn't hold true. And that seems to really trigger some rich learning. And I'm really enjoying using that one at the moment, which is another sibling. Yeah.
Irene will know about it, have something to say here.
Yeah, I call it surprise. In fact, it was my, you've got to start seeking those surprises, which is about challenging your assumptions. So I used the story form as well to say what kind of surprised you positively or negatively, and just see what themes emerge, and really trying to say, well, what does that mean going forward in terms of how you understand what might or might not shift, and very, very immediate kind of implications for practice, actually. So I've used it similar, this whole notion of some kind of salient, something that's almost visceral. You feel it in your body, a story like that. I think that's the part of it that I find really interesting. It's not just an indicator that's up here, but it lives in the body. And I think that's part of the beauty of it. It really is about, it has a quality dimension to its qualitative work that is very inspiring. Yeah.
I actually think it's got a bit of magic in MSC. There are times when other measures just didn't seem to be getting at that this things working well, but somehow measurements failing you. And MSC seems to land it. I mean, I've seen situations where MSC really saved the day. You know, it was the only thing that was really able to capture intangible outcomes. Yeah, so I still love it.
Could you give an example of that, Jess? One that springs to mind?
Put me on the spot now. Yeah, well, I mean, I was going to talk about it later, but we're doing a lot of work in collective impact at the moment, you know, where we're trying to look for systems shifts, and they're really intangible. So we're talking about power shifts, changes in flows, changes in mindsets, and like, it's hard to even describe it, but you can tell a story of it. You can tell a story of how people were thinking this way, and then they started to go, no, I have to do more than my job. It's not enough to do my job anymore. That's what systems change means. System change means ignoring your job description and working at the intersections between my job and your job. And that's the difference. And very, very tangible, making the intangible tangible. And it just, yeah, somehow it sends shivers through down your spine sometimes when you hear it. You go, ah, finally, that.
Yeah, it really does sound like it cuts to the heart of what's happening in a program, and moves beyond that, just, you know, what can be quite heady in numbers and figures. Is there any other evolutions of the approach or technique that we've missed out here? Anything else you've noticed that it's evolved into or become?
I could provide a partial answer to that. I mentioned the MSC bibliography, which has got about 220 entries in it. And I've just been scanning back the most recent entries in the bibliography from 2018 to the present. And there are about 23 new entries there. And what struck me was just the breadth of applications there. And I'm looking at its use in about 30 different countries around the world. The subject areas where it's been used, I just read some of them off: nutrition, human rights, community development, health, refugee settlements, medical training, substance abuse, climate change, suicide prevention, social work, agriculture, transport, gender, community development, youth work, health, information and communication, a whole stack of areas. And the range and ways of which people have used it have varied enormously, from the almost token, just using the word most significant change, but there's nothing else there that looks like most significant change, which some of you have alluded to already, over to very complex multi-country, multi-level selection processes expanding over multiple periods of time. So you've got a huge range of applications, often in conjunction with other methods. There was one very simple one there I saw where someone was doing some research into transport needs, and they were using a quantitative survey, and they were using MSC alongside, and it did classically exactly what Jess was saying. It was picking up the unexpected outcomes that people were experiencing of a transport intervention, whereas the questionnaire was picking up what was happening with the expected outcomes.
Thanks, Rick. It's great to understand a bit about where it's headed.
And just for those who don't know, it's been translated, the guide, it's been translated, I believe, into how many languages, Rick? Is it 12 now? I would say 12.
I think we've had full translations in about 8 and partial translations in probably another 3 or 4. Yeah. It's a bit hard to keep track because it's a very decentralized process. We're dependent on people letting us know when they're doing it.
It's a massive resource base. For those of you who want to find out more, there's a massive resource base of articles and people's master's degrees and PhDs and the guide itself. But in terms of evolution, when you think about when we first wrote it to today, I think some of it really stays true, doesn't it? The original. But I think we didn't write it so much to be used in evaluation. I think it's been used a lot on outcomes harvesting, the way it's used there, Irene. That sort of way of sort of capturing broad scale change and like using it as a net to understand all the change that's going on that you then bring in and make sense of, whether it's through realist evaluation or whether it's through using an outcomes harvesting or applying it to a theory of change. It's almost like a step. And I think we've learned that there's a harvest step and then there's a sense-making step. And MSC can be a really good harvest tool, and then you can use it, you can put it together with more sophisticated conceptual frameworks of various forms, but it still plays this really great way of doing that first, throw the net out, find out what's going on without your blinkers on. Yeah.
We have an interesting comment here from Australian Communities Foundation. I'm not sure your name there. When we used MSC, we discovered a project reduced violence in families, and this was not an anticipated outcome. The organisation doing this work was blown away by learning that. So that's a huge discovery that this tool facilitated. So it's a good case study there.
And I think people don't underestimate how important unexpected outcomes are, because I think often there's more unexpected ones than expected ones. It's a sort of fallacy of the world we live in, that we think we know what's going to happen, but really
both positive and negative, right, as well. So it doesn't just unearth the positive, it can unearth what's not working and why. Great. So what does Irene, this is a question for you. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the technique when it comes to picking up and making sense of power shifts?
So it's not all good, the MSc work. And in fact, I was chatting with a few colleagues yesterday, and in Oxfam, they've stopped recommending using it because they say that unless you can really invest properly in doing it well, it's actually just a positive story, confirmation bias kind of outcome. And I think that that's what I certainly saw early on in my use of it. We quickly introduced adding as many negative stories as positive stories. And we actually didn't want to, the farmers were keen to not sift. We went through the sifting exercise, but then the sifting exercise was accompanied by all the stories because they felt all of it were aspects of the change process. So when it comes to the power, and bringing that back to the power shifts aspect is, I think there's two sides to it. One is in the actual story collection process. I did it in the pure form, as based on my little stapled article in a group setting. And in a group setting, you inevitably have power dynamics. You have people who are more comfortable for all kinds of societal reasons, gender, age, hierarchy internally in their communities. And we did find that there was a kind of a self-censoring in some of the groups of not sharing some of the more contentious stories until we created that space for it. But there was then also in the process, those who had a rather loud voice and a rather strong opinion were the ones whose selection of stories made the cut. And I remember several incidents where particularly the local trade union leaders farmer leaders were the ones whose story, bubbled up to the surface, no matter what I tried in terms of facilitation. So that's where power shifts in the actual process doesn't necessarily happen. I think you need to create other ways of collecting and other ways of sorting that allow for more individual perspectives to be possible. I guess in the pure, and we're talking about the pure MSc form here, right? So the pure MSc form, the way I see it also in some of Oxfam's work is, and that's where I think it's good to embed it in an outcome harvesting type of logic. If you are only at one level in the changing the system, if you're only at I don't know, at a village level, or you're only in a local trade union level, you don't capture all the aspects of the power shifting that is happening or not happening that explains whether a system is moving. And so linking a theory of change to, linking MSc to a much wider theory of change, and then using it at the different, what I would call the nodes, where the power needs to shift, and understanding where it is and isn't shifting, that's where I think it can really help to identify where the shift is happening. But the method as such doesn't shift power, in my experience. I have very limited experience, but it really requires a particular facilitation for the power to shift, other than through the story and the power of the voice. So that's where some of the power could shift, where you say, well, here's another angle on this experience. So I think you've got to look at power shifting from a process point of view at several levels, and then at, does it describing in its content the full mechanisms, that's a bit of a mechanical word, but the full flow of power shifts.
Great, thanks, Irene. I know that Jess might have some contradicting or supplementary ideas to add to that. So Jess, over to you.
I mean, I do agree. Rick once said we were despairing about how MSC had been used. Do you remember when you said it's the most significantly abused technique? And I do see that it's abused. It's used poorly. It's easy to just grab a story and say you're using MSC, and it's not. Of course, it's got this whole, and then of course it does take a lot of thought about how you facilitate it. People who use it a lot, I think they really work with that stuff. Like, for example, often when we vote, we do individual voting. We don't just talk out loud, because that does silence people. We divide people in groups. So you have women together, men together. You're aware of the power dynamics and you work with it. That's not to say, that's not written into the guide necessarily, though, is it? That's happened over time as we've learnt to manage power. And I agree with you. MSC on its own doesn't necessarily shift power, but it can really beautifully raise voice of people whose voices doesn't normally get heard, because people who are often First Nations people, people from the community are great storytellers, and their stories go all the way through in a way that is often, doesn't happen. And of course it needs to be used with other methods. Sorry about my dog barking in the background.
Your dog agrees, Jess. Thank you. You go, Rick. Yep.
Just a comment about Irene's concern that with MSC you may only be capturing a certain sort of part of the causal process, from intervention to outcome and all the different ways that can happen. I think that risk is possibly greater if you're using MSC for evaluation, but if you're using MSC for monitoring purposes, where you're continually sampling on a periodic basis people's experiences of change, and given the fact that different people experience changes with happening at different speeds because they're in different contexts and different settings, I think the risk of under sampling or identifying changes at different points in a theory of change is much less if you're talking about impact monitoring. And I was pleased to see, when I did this scan of the 20 most recent publications, I reckon about 20% of them were using MSC for monitoring, which somewhat surprised me, because I had been of Jess's view that the dominant use of MSC these days is for evaluation, which I think broadly is true. I think evaluations accounted for about 60% of the uses that were documented in this last 20 cases, and the other 20% were research. It was quite, not surprisingly, given these are sort of published documents. Using MSC for research was quite common as well, and that's something perhaps we should give a bit more attention to.
But I do agree that using it with theory of change is really clever and a new way of thinking. And I remember we're going to be publishing an article about how we used it soon in a project in Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Kenya with Plan. And there we had a theory of change, we had a sort of phased theory of change, and we changed the domains from the beginning through the 5-year journey, and we looked at different parts of the system according to our theory of change. So at the beginning, we were collecting stories from the volunteers, the paralegal volunteers, because that's who we were working with. That's where we expected the change to be. And then we moved it on to the duty bearers, and then we moved it on to the people who were receiving the training, the beneficiaries. And we looked at different parts of the system that we were expecting to see change. And because of that's not in the MSC guide either, is it? So there are ways, there are more sophisticated ways to use it. Yeah, it's really interesting, Irene.
Maybe I could jump onto a point that I was going to make at some stage about, I think one of the big things that's promoted about MSC is it helps uncover or surface the values that people have and the differences in the areas of agreement in people's values. But I think the other aspect of MSC stories, which I think you're both heading in the direction of, Irene and Jess, is that MSC stories often have quite detailed descriptions of the causal mechanisms at work. And what interests me here is the overlap with realist evaluation, where they talk about context, mechanism, and outcome. And there's been a lot of debate about, well, what is a mechanism? And one of the most dominant sort of interpretations these days seems to be a mechanism is all about human reasoning or reactions to the context and the interventions they're exposed with, and how that then leads to particular outcomes. And I think MSC stories can be quite good in terms of surfacing that reasoning, the thinking that people are going on as they're experiencing what's going on. So I'd be really interested to see whether anyone's had any experience using MSC combined somehow with a realist perspective on evaluation. Irene, I think, was going to follow up.
Yeah, can I add to that, because that was an aspect that I didn't think we touched on before. I think there's two questions that are always useful to answer. Is it good compared to what? Right? I think is really important. And compared to indicators way, such a phenomenal additional contribution. And also compared to having data collection that doesn't explicitly then consider contribution. So contribution analysis as just without, it's a whole method called contribution analysis, but just the logic, what you were describing, Rick, of getting stories that then make explicit how it came about and how a particular organization or a particular initiative or a particular kind of collaboration kind of induced that change. That has been really useful for some of my colleagues in Oxfam, and it in a bit of a wake-up kind of way, because if you don't look at that explicitly, you can get a bit lazy and think that you're making a difference. But I think, but having explicit stories that confirm that or not will help you check what you're actually bringing to the table. So including that in the process will be, I think is a really important additional value. And of course, that's been really expanded in outcome harvesting as a method. There was one question up there about why not just use outcome harvesting? Yeah, you could use outcome harvesting. I think outcome harvesting actually is already a combination of MSE with outcome mapping. It's taken the kind of gem of the essence of the story notion. And that's what you did really well, Rick and Jess, is to say what has to be in it for it to actually give you some insights with that outcome harvesting. But outcome harvesting, of course, doesn't do any kind of selection. Well, it's not quite true. It does do some kind of selection, or it can do, but it doesn't have a necessarily a scaled sorting type of technique that gets you more insights about what's the difference that made the difference. I quote that so often, Rick, and I got that from you, and you got that from Bateson, right?
Gregory Bateson. All hail Gregory Bateson.
We've got a comment in here from Daniel Zandberg. Yes, I've used a realist approach with MSC. I found it a good way to discuss and approach the stories.
Tell us more.
He can't, unfortunately. You can drop it into the comment, Daniel. We've got you silenced, apologies. But if you've got any more to add, how so? We'd love to hear it.
I'd just love to add that the reason why MSC is good at addressing causality is because stories have a structure, the beginning, the middle, and the end. That's what defines a story. And also a good story, as I've learned over time, the bit that I wish we talked about more is the context, that you should really you should talk about the context at the beginning, what the situation, who the person is, what their backstory is. And especially when you work in First Nations context, it's really important that you take time to really hear the story behind the story as well, and then the change. But I think it's a great tool to use to feed into theory, and we use it to feed into theory of change. And, realist evaluation is one type of theory of change. A context, mechanism, outcome is one way of depicting theory about how change happens. So I think it's been used quite a bit, Rick. MSC's been used as a starting point for realist evaluation to help inform the theory, to help inform the theory of change, which is then tested. So it's used to feed it.
You're going to have to move us on, unfortunately. I want to make sure we give some time for audience's questions. So a question from Juana. How are you adapting MSC to the virtual landscape, given the current situation? How do you ensure participation isn't limited by the digital access and skills of different stakeholders?
Yeah, who do you want to? Shall I start? I'm sure we've all got something to say. I mean, to me, I always love MSC to be collected through a natural conversation. And I find when you get people to type it in to a website or a survey, you lose a lot. But you can have natural conversations over the phone, you can have them on Zoom, you can have them, you can video record each other and send it off and collect it locally. And then, so somehow if there can be a natural conversation, I think that it works. And so a lot of evaluations we're localizing. So instead of us flying out to places, lo and behold, we're using local partners. And isn't that a good thing? So I think there's some great thing coming out of COVID, using local partners, training people up to do it in the place that they're from, if that's possible. And also you can do it great. It works really well on Zoom. It works because it's conversational, and it can work. That would be my input.
Thanks, Jess.
What do
move on
you think?
to the next.
And smartphones are so easy to record. Anybody with a smartphone can record an MSC story now, and some of them actually automatically translate them, transcribe them even. Samsungs do apparently, yeah.
So why does MSC advocate selecting only one story? Are there cases where selecting a few stories captures the change better than just one? Go for it, Irene.
Okay, I want to add to that question because I think that's why I quite quickly left it to others, because I felt that by only selecting, and Rick, it would be great to hear why that was. I do understand that it was partly a marketing and an education of senior bureaucrats type of, was what I remember from the past, but it was, if you're talking about change and systems change and individual perspectives on that, I personally am a strong supporter of valuing all of that. And I didn't see the merit in selection other than by triggering the discussion, and that's really valuable, about, well, what was the difference that made the difference, that nudged a system either towards a negative or a positive direction. I think that the sorting process was above all valuable for that, but not because it then led to a single outcome that was the best outcome. I think that that's a wrong understanding personally of the value of sorting. And the sorting, it just disqualified so many other dimensions to a change process. So I'm really curious what Rick and Jess, clearly a lot of body language happening there.
Okay, well, obviously this is an issue that a lot of people have raised over time, and I will try to do my best to answer this. Firstly, when you're forced to make a choice between things, it means you have to forcing people to make a choice means they have to argue intensively over what really matters. It's less easy to have a comfortable compromise where you're not forced to question your own assumptions and the values that you're behind your decision. So it's about getting into the depth of the reasoning behind the choice when you force a choice like that. So it's all about surfacing those values and the assumptions you're making about what you're seeing in front of you. And that is so important. Remember, MSC was about organizational learning, which involves multiple levels, questioning your assumptions and your objectives. In the process of doing that, you are not devaluing the changes that you have not selected. It is simply that the changes that you have not selected still remain most significant for the person who selected that story. In their setting, that story remains the most significant in that setting. It's in the particular group, in that context, one story is seen as most significant for the reasons which have been extracted through discussion. Even then, it's standard practice, and I noticed that thematic analysis is carried out in just about every application I saw of MSC in the 22. Thematic analysis of the content of all the stories is probably the most universal feature of the use of MSC. So it's like with SenseMaker, you do pay attention to the content of all the stories. They are not thrown out. So I think those three key points: forcing an intensive and detailed discussion, recognizing that all stories will always remain locally most significant to the people who proposed them or selected them, and content analysis will give attention, equal attention to all the stories. Jess, over to you.
You said it beautifully. I just agree. It's a dialogue, it's a technique to force dialogue, to get people to talk about what matters. It's like a dynamic vision setting process. It's really, and that's the key to MSC, is it's an organizational learning tool. All the stories are still there. You can analyze them left, right, and center, thematically, content analysis. That's the easy part. The harder part is getting people to talk about what really matters and what are they trying to do. And that's where the magic happens for me. It's not just the story, it's the why did we choose this? Why did we choose this one? That's where it all comes out. Yeah.
Definitely.
But I think we come back to power shifts then, because it doesn't only come out, I mean, it also is a reflection of the power dynamics in the conversation. And I think how you disentangle those two is then, I mean, I completely agree. I started by saying that it was very much about the discussion, but I just didn't, I think that the kind of levitating of the single story to the surface is a reflection of sometimes, for sure, about the power dynamics as well. And then if that becomes the objective of the exercise, that's where I think you have poor quality MSC, because you then do shortcuts in the discussion in order to get to that single story. And that's not the purpose. And it could become that.
Maybe it's time to do version 2, Rick and Irene. Maybe we have to bring it together, you know, version 2, MSC 2.0. Yeah.
Stay tuned, everyone. Sounds like something's brewing up. I'm going to have to end us there, unfortunately. There's lots more questions that I'd love for us to be able to get to, but we're out of time, sadly. Thank you so much to our 3 panelists for making time to come and share your knowledge and wisdom with us all. Very much appreciated. Just want to let everyone know before we wrap up, we are running an online course on MSC, and that's kicking off in early October. And the information about that will come out in the email along with the video of this session. And also look out for a blog post on this topic coming out on social media soon. Thanks again to all my panelists. Thank you all for joining in and being great audience members, and look forward to seeing you either at the course or at another one of these webinars down the line. Thanks again.
Have a lot of fun. Thank you. Nice to see you all. Bye.